picture the scene. It's late November 1962. You are standing in Tizpur.
Right, major Indian frontier town.
Yeah, exactly, in Assam, sitting right on the north bank of the Brahmaputra River. And absolute unfiltered panic has just completely taken over the city.
Oh, it was a total breakdown of civil order. I mean, completely unprecedented.
Right. The local government is essentially, dissolving in real time. Officials are throwing open the doors of the local prisons. They're literally letting inmates walk free because there's just no one left to guard them.
Wow.
Yeah, and they're frantically loading civilians onto ferries to evacuate them south across the river. And the craziest part, in the banks and the treasuries, bureaucrats are shoveling piles of paper currency into massive bonfires,
Just burning the money.
literally burning the town's wealth.
Because they were absolutely certain that within hours, the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA, was going to roll right down from the Himalayas and capture the city.
Which, wasn't a crazy thought at that exact moment.
Not at all. The PLA had totally shattered the Indian defenses in the mountains to the north. There was virtually nothing standing between the advancing Chinese vanguard and the plains of Assam.
And it wasn't just like a localized panic in Tezkur either.
Huh.
Halfway across the world in Washington, D.C., the United States is watching this unfold with utter dread.
Oh, the Kennedy administration was terrified.
Right. They had just ordered an American aircraft carrier to race toward the Bay of Bengal to provide, desperate air support to India. We are talking about the very real, very terrifying prospect of Western military intervention against communist China.
Which means World War III is essentially on the table.
Exactly. The stakes could not have been higher. The momentum was entirely with Beijing. The Indian military apparatus in the Northeast Frontier Agency, or NIFA, had effectively collapsed.
And this is the crazy part, the most unexpected thing happens.
The Chinese just hit the brakes. They don't just stop, actually. They, throw it in reverse.
Yeah. On November 19th, 1962, Premier Zhou Enlai announces a unilateral ceasefire.
Just out of nowhere.
Completely unilateral. China declared that starting on November 21st, their frontier guards would just stop firing. And by December 1st, they would actively withdraw their troops 20 kilometers behind the line of actual control as it had existed 3 years earlier in November 1959.
And this right here, this moment, is where we really need to plant our flag today. Because this is the fourth module of our ongoing deep dive into the 1962 Sino-Indian War.
Right, a revision series.
Exactly. So previously, for everyone listening, we've walked through the freezing battlefields, the tactical firefights at Wolong and Rezangla, and the immediate border disputes. We've looked at the broken bones, essentially.
But today, we are diagnosing the disease that caused those bones to be so brittle in the first place.
Yeah, we're looking at the higher direction of war. The political arrogance, the institutional dysfunction, the logistical starvation, everything that led to that moment in Tezpur.
Because, as we always say, wars are fought by soldiers, but outcomes are shaped by national strategy and higher direction.
That's the core theme today. And that diagnosis really has to begin with understanding the anatomy of this ceasefire. Because it completely shatters the, conventional idea of how wars are supposed to end.
No, absolutely. Wars usually end with a decisive counteroffensive that pushes the enemy back. Or they end at a negotiating table where diplomats hash out a treaty.
But not here. China just walked away. But let's look at the territorial math, because they didn't walk away empty-handed. Not even close.
No. When we break down the geography, the strategic genius, and brutal genius of Mao Zedong's move becomes glaringly apparent.
They'll break that down for us.
Well, the Sino-Indian border dispute was primarily split into two massive sectors. You have the western sector, which is the Aksai-Chin Plateau, and the eastern sector, which is NIFA, what is today the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
West is Aksai-Chin, east is NIFA.
Right. So in the east, the PLA had conquered massive tracts of NIFA. They were knocking on the doors of Assam, like we said. But in their ceasefire declaration, they agreed to pull all the way back north of the McMahon Line.
Meaning they gave up practically all the territory they had bled to capture in the east.
Exactly. But in the west,
They stayed put.
they kept Aksai-Chin. If you look at the total disputed territory across the entire border, China retained about 32% of it, almost entirely in Aksai-Chin, and they gave back the remaining 68%, which was NIFA.
Okay, I have to push back here, or at least play devil's advocate for a second. If you're a Chinese general and you've just humiliated the enemy military, your troops are highly motivated, your enemy is literally burning their own currency in panic, why on earth do you give back 68% of the land you just took?
It's a great question, and it comes down to the principle of the culminating point, combined with a crystal clear political objective.
Okay, explain the culminating point.
So, from a military logistics standpoint, pushing further into the Indian plains of Assam would have stretched Chinese supply lines to the absolute breaking point.
Right, because they're coming over the Himalayas.
Exactly. They were already operating across the Tibetan Plateau over some of the most unforgiving mountain passes on Earth. Descending into the plains would expose them to Indian counterattacks where India actually had strong infrastructure, shorter supply lines, and crucially, the potential use of air power.
Right, the rubber band can only stretch so far before it snaps.
No.
If they go into Assam, they aren't fighting a mountain war anymore. They're fighting a conventional plains war against a massive, deeply entrenched nation.
Precisely. But more importantly, we have to look at what China actually wanted. You know, Clausewitz famously said that war is the continuation of politics by other means.
Right.
China didn't invade India to conquer the subcontinent. Their political aim was really twofold. First, secure the Aksai Chin Plateau.
Why Aksai Chin specifically?
Because they had built a vital strategic highway through it, connecting two restless Chinese provinces, Xinjiang and Tibet. That road was a completely non-negotiable artery for their national security.
Okay, and the second aim?
To shatter India's military prestige, to assert absolute dominance in Asia. By advancing rapidly, crushing the Indian army, and then magnanimously declaring, "We are stopping and withdrawing," Mao achieved total psychological victory.
He proved China could take whatever it wanted, whenever it wanted.
Exactly.
It's the ultimate power move. It reminds me of someone walking into a high-stakes poker game, pushing all their chips into the center of the table, forcing everyone else to fold in sheer terror, and then just leaving the winnings on the table and walking out the door.
That's a very apt analogy.
The message isn't, "I want your money." The message is, "I own this table."
Yes. And that dine and dash included a hidden trap. The Chinese ceasefire came with a massive caveat.
What was the caveat?
Beijing stated that while they were withdrawing 20 kilometers behind the 1959 line, they fully expected India to do the exact same thing to keep its armed forces 20 kilometers away from that line.
Oh, wow.
And China explicitly reserved the right to strike back if India tried to reoccupy the vacated areas.
So they essentially built a buffer zone inside Indian claimed territory, enforced entirely by psychological terror. "We are leaving, but if you step foot back in this room, we will come back and destroy you again."
Exactly. And this brings us to the international attempts to untangle this mess, because while the guns fell silent in late November, the diplomatic machinery just went into absolute overdrive.
Right, which is where we see the Colombo Conference enter the picture.
Yes, Chapter 14 stuff. Let's dig into that.
Let's do it, because it highlights a really painful reality for India. In December 1962, 6 nations met in Colombo, Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka. The attendees were Ceylon, the United Arab Republic, Cambodia, Ghana, Indonesia, and Burma.
And notice what these 6 nations have in common. They are all prominent members of the non-aligned movement.
Right. The very movement that Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru had championed for years. The whole idea that post-colonial nations didn't need to pick sides between the U.S. and the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
They were supposed to be this third moral force in global politics.
And this conference was their attempt to act as a neutral arbiter, right? The goal was to evolve a set of proposals to facilitate bilateral negotiations between India and China to solidify the peace.
Correct. So what did they actually propose?
Well, the Colombo proposals essentially suggested a compromise based on the realities on the ground. In the western sector, Aksai Chin, they proposed that China carry out its promised 20-kilometer withdrawal, while India would keep its existing military positions.
Right. And the resulting vacated strip would become a demilitarized zone administered by civilian posts from both sides without prejudice to the final border settlement.
And in the eastern sector, the recognized line of actual control would serve as the ceasefire line. It sounds like a fairly reasonable diplomatic off-ramp. So how did both sides react?
Well, India's response was definitive. Prime Minister Nehru, after consulting Parliament, conveyed that India accepted the Colombo proposals in toto, completely and without reservation.
But China balked.
China accepted them in principle, which, in diplomatic speak means they didn't accept them at all.
Right, it's a polite no.
Exactly. Beijing had massive reservations, specifically regarding the western sector. They absolutely refused to allow Indian troops or even civilian personnel back into that 20-kilometer strip in Aksai Chin.
Because they remembered India's aggressive forward policy before the war?
Exactly. They had no intention of allowing Indian boots back anywhere near their strategic highway. So because of that Chinese refusal, the Colombo proposals essentially died on the vine. They were never implemented into a binding bilateral treaty.
Wow. But we cannot leave this immediate post-war window without discussing something incredibly dark, which is the prisoner of war dynamic.
Yeah, this is a stark, measurable illustration of the sheer asymmetry of the conflict. By the end of November 1962, China held nearly 4,000 Indian military personnel as prisoners of war.
3,900 Indian officers and Jawans, to be precise. And how many Chinese soldiers did India capture and hold?
0. Not a single one.
That statistic alone, 3,900 to 0, it really tells the entire story of the operational collapse.
It does, although we should note a rather grim historical footnote here. While India held no Chinese soldiers, the Indian government did intern roughly 2,000 civilians of Chinese nationality or descent who were living in India.
Yeah, that's true. In the panic and paranoia of the war, these civilians were rounded up, mostly from places like Calcutta, and sent to an internment camp in Deoli, Rajasthan. It's a very painful chapter.
And it creates a bizarre diplomatic contrast. Because China refused to officially declare war, they didn't classify the captured Indian soldiers as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. They called them captives.
Which is a deliberate legal loophole.
Completely. By denying them POW status, China bypassed international monitoring norms. The Indian prisoners held in these freezing camps in Tibet were denied official visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Meanwhile, ironically, the interned Chinese civilians in Rajasthan were visited by the Red Cross.
Exactly. And China weaponized these Indian prisoners for psychological warfare and propaganda.
And this is where we see one of the most incredible stories of individual moral courage in military history. The Chinese authorities took captured Indian officers on these highly orchestrated, conducted tours of Chinese cities.
Right. The goal was to break their morale, to show them the industrial might of communist China, to make them feel small and defeated.
And their ultimate propaganda coup was planned for May 1st, 1963, May Day.
The International Workers' Holiday.
Right. The Chinese authorities devised a plan to take the senior captured Indian officers and parade them in front of the crowds in Tiananmen Square in Beijing. It would have been the ultimate humiliation for India on the global stage.
But they didn't account for Brigadier J.P. Dalvi?
No, they didn't. Brigadier Dalvi was the commander of the 7th Infantry Brigade, which had been basically annihilated at the Nongkachu River. He was the highest-ranking Indian officer in captivity.
And when the Chinese told him they were going to parade him and his officers in Tiananmen Square, Dalvi didn't just decline. He fiercely, unconditionally, and aggressively refused.
He essentially told his captors that they could shoot him, they could torture him, but under no circumstances would a commissioned officer of the Indian Army be paraded like a circus animal for a political stunt.
His defiance was so absolute, so uncompromising, that the Chinese authorities actually backed down. They dropped the idea entirely.
It's an astonishing display of leadership. While the generals in New Delhi had failed him, Dalvi, sitting in a freezing POW camp entirely at the mercy of his enemy, he held the line.
He really did. Eventually, Beijing returned the prisoners over the course of several months in 1963, framing it as a show of goodwill. But the damage was done. The psychological dominance was already established.
Okay, so we have this picture of the immediate aftermath. The guns have stopped. The prisoners are slowly coming home. The border is this tense, militarized stalemate. But the shockwaves of this one-month war did not stop at the Himalayas.
No, they rippled out across the entire globe.
And that is where I want to take this conversation next. Chapter 15, the international reactions. Because if you want to understand modern Asian geopolitics, you really have to look at how this localized border clash completely rewired the global circuitry.
It absolutely did. War outcome leads to a massive foreign policy impact chain.
Let's start with the West. The United States and the United Kingdom. When the Indian defenses in NEFA collapsed in mid-November, Prime Minister Nehru abandoned the lofty ideals of non-alignment.
Completely abandoned.
They sent 2 desperate letters to President John F. Kennedy, practically begging for direct military intervention. He asked for fighter squadrons to protect Indian cities from Chinese bombers.
And the Western response was astonishingly swift. Within 24 hours of Nehru's appeal, massive American and British transport planes were landing in Calcutta, disgorging tons of automatic weapons, winter clothing, and ammunition.
And what's crucial here is that Washington and London didn't use this as leverage. They didn't say, okay, India will save you, but you have to officially join NATO or abandon your non-aligned status. They just sent the guns. No demands for immediate payment.
Because the Kennedy administration viewed this through the stark binary lens of the Cold War. They didn't see this as a border dispute over an obscure Himalayan plateau. They saw it as blatant expansionist communist aggression.
Right.
Mao Zedong had been spouting incredibly aggressive rhetoric, claiming that the path to world communist conquest ran through places like Havana, Accra, and Calcutta.
Wait, I really want to dig into that. How seriously did the U.S. take this threat? Were they actually willing to go to war with China over India?
We have declassified transcripts from the National Security Council that show exactly how seriously they took it. In a meeting in May 1963, months after the ceasefire, President Kennedy and his top advisors were discussing contingency plans in case China launched a second invasion.
Oh.
Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, bluntly advised the president that if the U.S. had to intervene militarily to save India, they would likely have to use nuclear weapons.
That is genuinely terrifying.
Yeah.
They were actively discussing dropping nuclear bombs on Chinese supply lines in the Himalayas or on Chinese cities.
Both were considered. They recognized that conventional American ground forces could not effectively fight a massive land war in the Himalayas against millions of Chinese troops. The logistical nightmare was just too vast.
Yeah, obviously.
Therefore, the only way to stop a massive Chinese push into the Indian subcontinent in their strategic calculus was the nuclear option.
It really puts that dine and dash ceasefire into perspective. Mao stopped the war literal hours before American air power and potentially American nuclear doctrine became deeply entrenched in the conflict.
Now, if the U.S. reaction was predictable, capitalists rushing to stop communists, the reaction of the Soviet Union is where the geopolitical chessboard gets flipped upside down.
Right, because on paper, the Soviet Union and China are communist brothers. They share the same ideology. So you would assume Moscow would cheer on Beijing as they crush democratic India.
But you have to look at the timeline. By 1962, the Sino-Soviet split was already a yawning chasm. Nikita Khrushchev and Mao Zedong despised each other.
They really did.
They disagreed on Marxist ideology, on how to handle the West, and on global strategy. Moscow viewed Mao as a dangerous, reckless radical who was trying to drag the communist bloc into a nuclear holocaust.
And how did that animosity play out regarding India?
In a way that absolutely infuriated Beijing. Instead of backing their communist neighbor, the Soviet Union actively supported India. Let's go back just a few months before the war.
Oh, yeah.
In August 1962, Moscow and New Delhi signed a massive defense agreement. The USSR agreed to sell India 12 advanced MiG-21 supersonic fighter jets, and crucially, they provided the technical assistance and licensing for India to eventually manufacture these jets domestically.
This is huge. The U.S. and Britain had actually refused to sell supersonic fighters to India, but the Soviets stepped in.
Exactly, and imagine how this looked from Beijing. The Soviets had recently withdrawn all their technical advisors from China, leaving Chinese infrastructure projects half-finished.
Oh, wow.
And now, those same Soviets are handing advanced jet fighters to China's southern rival. It was a massive betrayal in Mao's eyes.
But once the shooting actually started in October, didn't the Soviets briefly try to walk a tightrope? I seem to remember a moment where Moscow asked India to accept Chinese peace terms.
They did for a very brief window. And the reason why is entirely tied to the other massive global event happening at that exact moment, the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Ah, let's unpack the synchronization.
Yeah.
This is one of those fascinating layers of this entire deep dive.
Let's look at the dates. The Chinese launched their massive coordinated invasion of India on October 20th, 1962.
Right.
Just days earlier, American spy planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. During the last week of October, the U.S. and the USSR were locked in a standoff that brought the world to the absolute brink of nuclear annihilation.
So the two superpowers are entirely preoccupied. Kennedy and Khrushchev are staring at each other with their fingers hovering over the red buttons. Neither of them has the bandwidth to deal with a war in the Himalayas.
Exactly. Mao Zedong used the Cuban Missile Crisis as a geopolitical shield. He knew the U.S. wouldn't intervene while dealing with Cuba. And initially, because Khrushchev desperately needed Chinese political support in the communist bloc during his standoff with Kennedy, Moscow briefly backed Beijing's position on the border war.
But the moment the Cuban Missile Crisis ends,
The moment Khrushchev agrees to pull the missiles out of Cuba in late October, the Soviet calculus shifts again. The immediate danger is gone. Moscow reverts to its anti-Mao stance.
And they resume their support for India.
Yes. After the border war, as India realizes it desperately needs to modernize its shattered military, the USSR steps in with massive loans, low prices, and technical help. By 1964, India had become one of the largest purchasers of Soviet military hardware in the world.
So this one-month Himalayan War essentially birthed the Indo-Soviet strategic partnership that defined the rest of the Cold War.
It really did.
Okay, so we have the US and UK rushing in with emergency aid and the USSR setting up long-term arms deals. Who is sitting on the sidelines watching this massive influx of advanced weaponry into India and absolutely losing their minds?
Pakistan.
The Pakistan factor. This is a critical domino in the geopolitical chain reaction.
To understand Pakistan's reaction, you have to remember that since the violent partition of the subcontinent in 1947, India and Pakistan viewed each other as existential threats. They had already fought a war over Kashmir in 1947.
But wasn't there a point where Pakistan actually suggested teaming up with India against China?
Yes, there was. In 1959, Pakistan's president, Ayub Khan, had proposed a joint defense pact to India. He argued that the real threat to the subcontinent came from the northern enemies, meaning the communist powers of China and the Soviet Union.
Interesting.
But Prime Minister Nehru categorically rejected it. He famously asked, joint defense against whom? Nehru was committed to non-alignment and didn't want to antagonize Beijing.
Talk about a, quote, aging terribly.
Right. But once 1962 happens, and the U.S. starts pouring weapons into India, Pakistan's entire strategic calculus flips.
It has to. I mean, Pakistan was a member of U.S.-led alliances like SEATO and CENTO. They felt they were America's loyal ally in the region.
Suddenly, they see Washington arming their mortal enemy, India, with no strings attached. Pakistan's external affairs minister publicly declared this Western aid to India as an unfriendly act towards Pakistan.
Because they assume, probably correctly, that once the Chinese threat subsides, India is going to take all those shiny new American and Soviet weapons and point them straight at Islamabad.
That was their exact fear. And so Pakistan executes a massive geopolitical pivot. They decide that if the U.S. is going to arm India, Pakistan needs a new, powerful friend.
They immediately warm up to Beijing.
Yes. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. By late 1962, even before the Sino-Indian ceasefire was fully solidified, Pakistan and China began negotiating their own shared border in the Kashmir region. And by early 1963, they signed the landmark Sino-Pakistan Border Agreement.
And Pakistan actually gave up territory to China to seal this deal, didn't they?
They did. Pakistan ceded a significant portion of its northern claim line in Pakistani-controlled Kashmir to China. It was a strategic concession to solidify a vital alliance.
And this treaty laid the foundation for the ironclad China-Pakistan axis that still profoundly impacts Asian security today. But it didn't just end with a treaty. This leads directly to more violence, doesn't it?
It does. This is the ultimate tragedy of the 1962 war. Pakistan watched the Indian military completely collapse against the Chinese. They saw the Indian command structure fail, the logistics crumble, the troops break.
And they drew a fatal conclusion.
Yes. Pakistan's leadership concluded, India is weak.
They smelled blood in the water.
Exactly. This perception of Indian military vulnerability directly emboldened Pakistan to launch Operation Gibraltar in 1965, attempting to infiltrate and capture Kashmir, which triggered the massive Second Indo-Pakistani War.
So if we look at the chain reaction, India's defeat by China led to massive Western and Soviet armament of India, which triggered Pakistani paranoia, which pushed Pakistan into an alliance with China, which ultimately emboldened Pakistan to attack India in 1965.
It is a stunning cascade of consequences.
It really is. And all of it stems from the fact that India failed so spectacularly on the battlefield. Which brings us to Chapter 16, the core of our deep dive, the million-dollar question. If India had the potential backing of superpowers, if they were defending their own territory against an enemy fighting at the end of a 1,000-mile logistical nightmare across the Tibetan Plateau, how did India lose so badly?
This is where we transition from the geopolitical ripple effects to the root cause of the disaster. We have to examine the political factors contributing to India's defeat. We have to really diagnose the disease.
Let's lay out the anatomy of military failure. It's not just a bad day on the battlefield. It's a sequence. It starts at the very top. So for you listening, if you are taking notes on the political causes of defeat, here is your framework. A flawed political aim leads to inadequate military capability. That inadequacy creates a massive execution gap on the ground, and that gap inevitably results in operational failure. Flawed politics equals broken armies.
That is a perfect framework. The higher direction of war relies on three pillars: the formulation of national policy, the evolution of national aims based on a realistic threat assessment, and the readiness of the armed forces to execute those aims.
And India failed on all three.
Comprehensively. In the decade leading up to 1962, the Indian political leadership failed on all three counts.
So let's trace the timeline of this strategic blindness, because the warning signs were flashing neon red for over a decade. Let's start in 1950.
1950 is the geopolitical earthquake. The newly formed People's Republic of China, under Mao Zedong, militarily occupies Tibet.
Before this, Tibet was essentially a massive, peaceful buffer zone between India and China. India didn't share a militarized border with China. They shared it with a deeply religious, isolated Tibet.
But once the PLA marches into Lhasa, that buffer just vanishes. Suddenly, an expansionist, heavily militarized communist superpower is sitting right on the Himalayas, gazing down at the Indian plains. It is a fundamental shift in India's security environment.
And how did New Delhi react to this massive threat suddenly appearing on their doorstep?
With profound denial, Prime Minister Nehru was deeply committed to the idea of Asian solidarity. He believed that the era of imperialism was over, and that India and China, as the two great ancient civilizations of Asia, would lead the post-colonial world together in peace.
Okay, I have to jump in here. Look, hindsight is 20/20, but put yourself in Nehru's shoes in the early 1950s. India is a desperately poor, newly independent nation trying to build schools and hospitals. The last thing he wants is a massive arms race or a militarized border that drains the national budget. Isn't it somewhat rational to try and build diplomatic bridges rather than immediately assuming the worst?
It is entirely rational to desire peace, but it is a dereliction of national security to formulate policy assuming peace without preparing for war. Hope is not a strategy.
Hope is not a strategy. It's a great line.
The Indian government accepted vague, meaningless assurances of friendship from Beijing. Even when China started publishing official maps that claimed tens of thousands of square miles of Indian territory in Aksai Chin and Nefa as their own, Nehru's government essentially downplayed it.
They thought it was just a cartographic error, like a typo on a map.
They chose to believe that China would eventually negotiate a settlement based on traditional boundaries, ignoring the fact that Communist China viewed those traditional boundaries as illegal imperialist lines drawn by the British.
And this willful blindness reaches its absolute peak with the Aksai Chin Road. This is one of the most staggering intelligence failures of the 20th century.
It truly is. Aksai Chin is a massive, high-altitude desert in the north of Kashmir. India claimed it, but it was incredibly remote and largely unpatrolled.
Right.
China realized they needed a reliable land route to connect their western province of Xinjiang with their newly conquered territory of Tibet. The easiest geographic route lay right through the Aksai Chin Plateau.
So China just starts building a highway, a massive engineering project involving thousands of workers, heavy machinery, explosives, blasting through mountains, inside territory that India claims on its maps.
And it took the Indian government nearly 3 years to even realize it was happening.
Wait, 3 years? How is that even possible? Did they not have spies? Air reconnaissance?
The general failure of intelligence at the national level was profound. The director of the Intelligence Bureau, Mr. B.N. Mullik, held immense sway over Nehru, but the intelligence apparatus was focused on internal security and Pakistan.
They were looking the wrong way.
Exactly, largely ignoring the logistical realities of the Chinese buildup in Tibet. The government only officially confirmed the existence of the road in 1957.
And even then, it wasn't the intelligence agencies that found it, right?
No, it was an Indian Army patrol that finally stumbled upon the completed highway.
Like, imagine being that patrol commander who crests a ridge and just sees a massive Chinese highway running right through what you thought was your country.
It's mind-blowing. And once this road became public knowledge in India, the political pressure on Nehru exploded.
Oh, I'm sure. The public and the parliament must have been outraged.
They felt betrayed by China and felt the government looked weak and incompetent. And it was this intense domestic political pressure combined with a fundamental misreading of Chinese intentions that birthed the most disastrous military policy of the era.
The forward policy.
The forward policy.
This is the match that lit the powder keg. What exactly was it?
In late 1961, the Indian government decided it had to visually and physically reassert its claim over the disputed territories. The forward policy directed the Indian Army to establish a series of small, isolated military posts across the entire disputed border.
Aggressively pushing up to, and sometimes past, Chinese positions. It sounds like a game of geopolitical chicken. You plant a flag in the snow, put 10 guys in a tent with rifles and tell them to stare down the Chinese outpost 100 yards away.
That's exactly what it was. But militarily, it was a death sentence. Let's talk about the physics and logistics of the forward policy, because that is where the mechanism of failure really lies.
Yes, let's break that down. Why is planting a flag a military disaster?
Because of the principle of interior lines and mutual support. In military strategy, if you establish an outpost, it must be supported by a logistics chain that can feed it, supply it with ammunition, and reinforce it.
Right.
It must be covered by artillery situated further back. If the outpost is attacked, it needs to be able to hold out until help arrives or safely fall back to a stronger defensive line.
A defensive web.
Exactly. The forward policy created the opposite of a web. It created penny packets, tiny isolated groups of soldiers scattered across hundreds of miles of freezing, inaccessible Himalayan terrain.
Penny packets. That's a great exam keyword for our listeners.
Yes, note that down. These penny packets had no tactical backing, there were no roads behind them, only treacherous goat paths that took weeks to traverse. There was no artillery support, there were no reserves to rush to their aid.
So if the Chinese decided to attack one of these posts,
the post would be annihilated instantly. They were sitting ducks, completely disconnected from any viable military infrastructure.
this brings us to a massive contradiction. The Indian Army in 1962 was a professional force. They had fought in World War II. They had fought in Kashmir. The generals knew how logistics worked. Did the top brass not look at the forward policy, look at a map and say, Prime Minister, this is suicide?
They absolutely did. And this is where we see the fatal civil-military disconnect that doomed India.
Chapter 17, Analysis of Higher Direction of War. This is the most important section of this deep dive. Let's get into the personalities.
The professional military leadership objected vehemently. General K.S. Tamaya, who was the chief of the Army staff until 1961, clearly understood the military reality. He repeatedly warned the political leadership that India could not win a war against China in the Himalayas with the current force structure and logistical network.
And he wasn't just complaining, he actually offered an alternative, right?
The
Thorat plan.
Yes. Lieutenant General S.P.P. Thorat, who was the commander of Eastern Command, drafted a highly realistic professional war plan. The Thorat plan essentially argued against the forward policy.
What did it propose instead?
It proposed establishing a primary line of defense much further south, deeper inside Indian territory, where the terrain favored the defender and where the Indian Army could actually maintain supply lines and artillery support. The idea was to let the Chinese stretch their own supply lines over the mountains and then bleed them dry at a defensive line of India's choosing.
That sounds like textbook defense in depth. Let the enemy overextend, then crush them. How did the politicians react to the Thorat plan?
They ignored it.
Entirely.
In fact, Defense Minister Krishna Menon dismissed it completely. There are reports that the Thorat plan was never even officially shown to Prime Minister Nehru.
How does a defense minister just bury a comprehensive war plan from a theater commander without the prime minister knowing? Where were the institutional checks and balances?
They were completely broken down. India had an institution designed exactly for this, the Defense Committee of the Cabinet, or the DCC. It was supposed to include the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the Finance Minister, and the Home Minister, along with the military chiefs.
It was meant to be the supreme body for assessing threats and aligning national strategy with military funding. Let me guess. It was a glorified echo chamber.
Worse, it was paralyzed by toxic personalities. The defense minister, V.K. Krishna Menon, was a brilliant but deeply abrasive and polarizing figure. He was highly ideological and deeply distrustful of the professional military brass.
Okay, and on the other side?
On the other side, you had the finance minister, Morarji Desai, who was fiercely fiscally conservative and refused to allocate foreign exchange to buy modern weapons for the army.
So the military is telling them, if you want us to enact this aggressive forward policy, you need to buy us winter clothing, automatic rifles, and build roads. And the finance minister says no money, while the defense minister says just go do it anyway.
Precisely. And Nehru, instead of acting as a decisive executive and resolving this deadlock, allowed the dysfunction to fester. The armed forces were starved of urgently needed funds. They were sent to altitudes of 14,000 feet in cotton summer uniforms and canvas shoes.
It's just tragic.
Carrying World War II vintage Lee Enfield bolt-action rifles, facing Chinese troops armed with modern automatic AK-47s and heavy mortars.
But wait, even with the political dysfunction, if General Tamaya was telling them it was suicide, how did the forward policy get implemented? Did the politicians just order the army to march to their deaths?
The politicians relied on a fatal assumption, and they found generals willing to echo it. Nehru and Menon had convinced themselves of an incredibly dangerous theory. They believed that China would not shoot back.
I'm sorry, what? They thought the Chinese army, which had fought the Americans to a standstill in Korea just a decade earlier, would just let Indian troops walk up and build bunkers next to them.
Yes. Nehru's strategic assessment was that China was dealing with internal chaos from the Great Leap Forward, a simmering revolt in Tibet, and the threat of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan.
So he thought Mao was too distracted.
He believed Mao couldn't risk a border war, and that international pressure, specifically the fear of American intervention, would prevent the PLA from launching a major offensive. The forward policy was conceived as a diplomatic bluff, a game of brinkmanship.
But a bluff only works if you're holding cards. India was holding a pair of twos, and China was holding a royal flush. And what happens to General Tamaya, the guy who tried to point this out?
He was sidelined, humiliated by Menon, and eventually retired in 1961. And this is the most critical turning point in the higher direction of the war. When Tamaya left, the government didn't promote strong, independent thinkers to replace him. They promoted compliant officers. They wanted yes-men.
Entered General P.N. Thapar and General B.M. Kaul.
Yes. General Thapar became the new chief of the Army staff. Thapar was a gentleman, but he lacked the moral courage to stand up to Krishna Menon and Nehru. He had deep reservations about the forward policy, but when told to execute it, he acquiesced.
But the true symbol of the institutional rot was the rise of Lieutenant General B.M. Kaul.
Kaul.
General Kaul is a name that haunts the history of 1962.
Mm.
Who was he and why is he so central to this disaster?
Kaul was a supply and logistics officer who had virtually no combat command experience. But he had one immense qualification. He was a distant relative and a close personal protege of Prime Minister Nehru.
Political patronage. Nepotism at its worst.
Blatant patronage. With the backing of Nehru and Menon, Kaul saw a meteoric rise through the ranks, bypassing highly experienced combat generals. He was appointed chief of the general staff, effectively making him the second most powerful man in the army.
And what did Kaul do?
He enthusiastically championed the politicians' forward policy. He told Nehru and Menon exactly what they wanted to hear, that the army could push the Chinese back and that the Chinese wouldn't fight.
It's the ultimate echo chamber. The politicians create a fantasy based on hope, and they promote a general who validates the fantasy to secure his own power. And the cost of that fantasy is paid in blood by the soldiers on the ground.
Which brings us to the tipping point, the moment when the fantasy collided with reality. We need to look closely at the higher command failures during the actual outbreak of hostilities. This is the defining case study for higher direction of war, and it's the tragedy of Thogler Ridge.
Thogler Ridge. This is in the eastern sector in NIFA. Paint the picture for us. What is the tactical situation here?
It is late summer 1962. The Chinese PLA has crossed the McMahon Line and occupied Thogler Ridge, a dominating high-altitude feature. Below the ridge runs the Nam Kachou River. The Indian 7th Infantry Brigade is rushed to the Nam Kachou Valley to confront them.
Okay, so the Chinese have the high ground on the ridge, and the Indians are down in the river valley. Tactically, that is a nightmare for India.
It is indefensible. The Indian troops are strung out in a thin line along a freezing river. They have no artillery support because there are no roads to bring the guns up. The porters dropping supplies have to march for over a week from the nearest roadhead just to bring them rations.
They're practically starving, freezing, and sitting in the crosshairs of massive Chinese artillery batteries parked on the ridge above them. Any first-year cadet at a military academy would look at that map and say, withdraw immediately to higher defensible ground.
And that is exactly what the local brigade commander and the division commander and the corps commander, Lieutenant General Umrao Singh, all recommended. They said, we cannot fight here. We must pull back to a logistical base.
But the news of the Chinese occupying Thogler Ridge has hit the Indian newspapers. The parliament is screaming for action. Nehru's government is being accused of cowardice.
So on September 22nd, 1962, the government issues an order to the army. The order is simple, blunt, and completely divorced from reality. Evict the Chinese from Thogler Ridge.
Let's stop and unpack the gravity of that word, evict.
Right.
You evict a tenant who didn't pay rent. If you order your army to forcibly remove a foreign army from a disputed territory, you are not conducting a police action, you are declaring war.
Exactly. It is a monumental strategic decision. A decision of that magnitude should involve deep, agonizing deliberation by the entire cabinet, a thorough assessment of national readiness, and clear strategic directives signed by the highest executive authority in the land.
So who signed this eviction order? The Prime Minister, the President, the Defense Minister.
When Army Chief General Thapar, who was deeply nervous about this, knowing his troops were vastly outnumbered, asked for the orders in writing to protect himself. The order was signed by an undersecretary in the Ministry of Defense.
An undersecretary, a mid-level bureaucrat, signed a piece of paper that effectively initiated a war with a global superpower.
It is the ultimate proof of the breakdown of higher direction. The defense minister, Krishna Menon, verbally pushed for it, but the bureaucratic machinery treated an act of war as a routine administrative memo.
It's just nuts.
The politicians issued a fantasy order, the army chief failed to resign in protest, and the mandate to commit mass suicide was passed down the chain of command.
And when that order reached the Corps commander in the East, General Limrao Singh, he looked at it and essentially said, "No, I will not order my men to be slaughtered."
General Limrao Singh showed remarkable professional integrity. He submitted in writing that an attack on Thagla Ridge was impossible without adequate buildup and logistical preparation. He refused to blindly execute a politically motivated suicide mission.
So what does New Delhi do? Do they listen to the guy who actually knows the terrain?
No. They fire him.
Unbelievable.
They remove General Limrao Singh from command of that sector, and to replace him, to ensure that the political order to evict the Chinese is carried out, they create a brand new Command 5E Corps, and they put their favorite political general in charge.
General Cole.
Yes. Kal leaves his comfortable desk job in Delhi and flies out to Tezpur to take command. He is full of bravado, promising the prime minister that he will personally throw the Chinese out.
But reality has a funny way of asserting itself.
Yeah.
What happens when Kal actually gets to the Nongkachu River and looks up at Thagla Ridge?
The bravado evaporates. Kal arrives at the front line in early October. For the first time, he actually sees the terrain. He sees the freezing, starving men of the 7th Brigade. He looks up and sees the massive Chinese bunkers, the heavy machine guns, the artillery pieces being wheeled into position.
The reality of the tactical situation finally penetrates his political delusion.
He realizes Limrao Singh was right all along. He realizes that if the Indian Brigade fires a single shot, they will be wiped off the face of the earth.
But Kal is paralyzed. He doesn't have the moral courage to countermand the Prime Minister's orders, but he knows he can't attack.
So he falls terribly ill, partly from the altitude, partly from sheer psychological stress, and is evacuated back to a hospital in Delhi.
Wait, he just leaves. He takes command, realizes it's a death trap, gets sick, and flies back to Delhi, leaving the 7th Brigade sitting in the river valley.
Yes. He attempts to command the Corps from his sickbed in Delhi, and while he's gone, on October 20th, the Chinese finally decide they are done waiting. They launch a massive coordinated artillery barrage, followed by human wave assaults.
And the 7th Infantry Brigade is annihilated in hours. Brigadier Delvey is captured. The rout begins.
It is a stunning systemic collapse. The political leadership operates on delusion. The top generals amplify the delusion for career advancement. The only generals who speak the truth are fired, and the soldiers pay the price.
And this rot wasn't just at the top in Delhi or at the core level with Kal. Let's look at the intermediate layer, Eastern Command.
Eastern Command is a masterclass in how not to direct a war theater. Their headquarters was located in Lucknow.
For our listeners who don't have a map of India in front of them, how far is Lucknow from the battlefields of Nifa?
It is hundreds and hundreds of miles away, deep in the plains of Uttar Pradesh. The general officer commanding in chief of Eastern Command, Lieutenant General L.P. Sen, was completely divorced from the physical realities of the front line.
He hadn't extensively toured the treacherous terrain he was supposed to be defending.
No, he was fighting a war by looking at a flat paper map on a desk.
Which is incredibly dangerous. A map doesn't show you that a 1-inch line represents a sheer 10,000-foot cliff that takes a week to climb.
Exactly. And from that office in Lucknow, he made disastrous, fatal interventions. For example, before the Chinese attacked, Eastern Command ordered troops to occupy an advanced position called Sangley on Thagla Ridge. It served absolutely no tactical purpose. It only further dispersed the already stretched Indian forces, weakening the main defensive posture, simply to satisfy a political desire to show aggressive movement on a map.
But Sen's most catastrophic failure came after the Nongkachu disaster, when the Indian Army desperately tried to establish a fallback defensive line.
Right. Okay, the first line is gone. Where do you make your stand?
The obvious choice was the Sela Pass. It is a massive, dominating geographical bottleneck. If provisioned correctly, a determined force could hold Sela against vastly superior numbers.
And the man on the ground, the commander of the 4th Infantry Division, Major General N. Prasad, wanted to hold Sayla, right?
Yes. General Prasad understood the ground, he understood his troops, and he had the will to dig in and fight a defensive battle. But the army commander in Lucknow, General Sen, acting on incredibly ill-considered thinking and personal friction, decided to intervene.
In the middle of an active Chinese invasion, with the army in full retreat, Keenan fired General Prasad.
You don't fire the guy who knows the terrain and wants to fight in the middle of a rout? Who did he replace him with?
He brought in Major General A.S. Pathania. Pathania had a distinguished combat record from the past, but he had zero knowledge of the Nepha terrain. He didn't know his subordinate commanders, and he was completely unfamiliar with the troops he was suddenly leading into a desperate defense.
It's an infantile assumption. The idea that you can just take a guy with a bunch of medals, drop him onto a frozen mountain he's never seen, in charge of men he's never met, and expect him to perform magic.
And magic did not happen. When the Chinese inevitably bypassed and attacked the Sela positions, the new command structure disintegrated. General Pathania panicked.
Oh, man.
Eastern Command in Lucknow issued contradictory, vague orders. Orders to hold firm were followed by orders to withdraw, which were then canceled, which were then reissued.
The Indian troops, many of whom were fighting fiercely, were betrayed by a chaotic, terrified higher command that essentially ordered them to abandon impregnable positions and run.
It is the ultimate tragedy of 1962. The Indian Jawans, the frontline soldiers, fought with incredible bravery. At places like Walong and Razangla, they fought to the last man and the last round. The failure was not one of courage, it was a failure of the men wearing the stars on their shoulders.
The vital lesson here is the difference between healthy civilian control of the military and toxic political interference in military operations. In a democracy, the civilian government must set the strategic goals, but they must rely on the unvarnished, brutal, professional truth of the military to determine how or even if those goals can be physically achieved.
When politicians silence the professionals and promote sycophants who tell them what they want to hear, they are marching their nation into an ambush.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time dissecting the Indian collapse, but we have to cross the Himalayas now. Because China didn't just win by default. They didn't just walk into empty territory. They executed a masterclass in military strategy.
Chapter 18. The application of operational art by the Chinese People's Liberation Army.
If the Indian side is a study in dysfunction, the Chinese side is a study in brutal, ruthless efficiency. Let's first define operational art, because it is the crucial bridge in warfare.
All right. Strategy is the big picture, deciding you want to control Aksai Chin and humiliate India. Tactics is the small picture, how a platoon maneuvers to take out a machine gun bunker.
So what is operational art?
Operational art is the connective tissue. It is how a commander designs, organizes, and sequences major campaigns and battles to achieve that strategic goal. It is the sequencing of logistics, deception, timing, and massing of forces.
And the Chinese execution of this was ripped straight from the ancient texts of Sun Tzu, tempered by decades of modern bloody experience.
Mao Zedong was supremely confident, wasn't he? He wasn't intimidated by the Indian Army's reputation from World War II.
Not in the slightest. In early October 1962, as the PLA was massing for the invasion, Mao briefed his top commanders in Beijing. He dispelled any notion of just coexisting with India. He laid out the historical pedigree of his army.
What did he say?
He said, and I quote, "We fought a war with old Chiang Kai-shek. We fought a war with Japan and one with America and Korea. During none of these did we fear. And in each case we won. Now the Indians want to fight a war with us. Naturally, we don't have fear."
Wow. When you put it like that, the PLA had been fighting continuously for 30 years. They fought a massive civil war. They fought the Imperial Japanese Army, and they fought the United States Marines at the Chosin Reservoir.
The Indian Army had fought border skirmishes in Kashmir. The experience gap is staggering.
And that experience translated into a flawless execution of 6 key principles of operational success. Let's walk through them, contrasting the Chinese operational art with Indian operational weakness.
Principle 1. Surprise and deception. This is the cornerstone of Chinese military doctrine.
The Chinese maximized political, strategic, and tactical shock. Diplomatically, they used ongoing negotiations to mask their true intentions, lulling Nehru into a false sense of security. Militarily, they executed an incredibly complex logistical buildup in Tibet under total secrecy.
How do you hide an army in the Himalayas?
Strict discipline, night movements, camouflage. They concealed the true nature of their deployments, the identities of their veteran commanders, and their supply routes. Furthermore, they launched massive, coordinated attacks on two separate fronts in Aksai Chin and Nefa that were separated by 2,500 kilometers. The sheer scale and synchronization of the offensive caught India completely off guard.
Contrast that with India's forward policy, which was essentially walking out into an open field, waving a flag, and broadcasting exactly where their tiny undersupplied outposts were located.
Right, completely reactive planning versus Chinese surprise.
Now, Principle 2 is opportune timing. And we already touched on this with the Cuban Missile Crisis, but it deserves to be highlighted as a masterpiece of operational timing.
It is the defining geopolitical maneuver of the conflict. Operational art isn't just about weather or terrain, it is about reading the global chessboard. China waited until the exact moment the United States and the Soviet Union were paralyzed by the threat of nuclear war over Cuba.
They used the threat of global Armageddon as a smokescreen for a regional invasion.
Exactly. And the moment the U.S. signaled the crisis was ending, when Kennedy terminated the naval quarantine of Cuba, China immediately declared their unilateral ceasefire. They used the Cuban Missile Crisis as their stopwatch, ensuring the superpowers could never intervene in time.
Incredible. Principle 3. Concentration of force, or hit fast, hit hard.
The Chinese did not engage in slow, grinding sieges. They understood that in the high mountains, speed and mass are everything. They didn't spread their forces evenly across the border. They identified the specific points of Indian weakness, and they concentrated overwhelming local superiority at those exact points.
I've read descriptions of these human wave assaults. It sounds chaotic, just thousands of men charging, but it was actually highly orchestrated, wasn't it?
Very orchestrated. They used infiltration tactics. They would pin down an Indian frontal defense with heavy mortar and artillery fire, while highly mobile infantry units would scale seemingly impassable cliffs and ravines in the dead of night to attack the Indian positions from the rear or the flanks. They bypassed strong points, cutting off retreat routes and creating absolute panic.
Which perfectly exploited India's weakness. Because the Indian forces were dispersed in those isolated penny packets, they had no defense in depth. Once the Chinese broke through the thin crust of the front line, there were no Indian reserves behind them to plug the gap.
Precisely. Which leads to Principle 4, military gambles. The Chinese commanders were willing to take calculated risks. They trusted their troops' endurance. They pushed deep into Indian territory, moving incredibly fast, gambling that their light logistics relying on porters and local foraging could keep up with their advancing infantry before the Indians could regroup.
Principle 5. Mask offense as defense. This is the information warfare angle.
China never officially called it an invasion. They termed their massive, pre-planned, coordinated, multi-corps assault a counterattack and self-defense.
Orwellian doublespeak.
But highly effective. By pointing to India's aggressive forward policy patrols, Beijing constructed a narrative that they were merely defending their sovereignty against Indian imperialism. This muddied the diplomatic waters internationally, giving hesitant nations an excuse not to condemn China, and domestically it gave the PLA soldiers a righteous cause to fight for.
And finally, Principle 6. Clear political and military aims. We talked about this at the beginning with the ceasefire, but it is the bedrock of operational art.
China knew exactly what success looked like before they fired a shot. The political aim, dictated by Beijing, was to teach India a lesson and assert dominance.
And the military aims.
Precise. In the West, advance only to the 1960 claim line to secure the Aksai Chin Road and stop. In the East, annihilate the main Indian fighting forces in the Kemeng Frontier Division to inflict maximum psychological trauma, and then withdraw to look magnanimous.
They fought to achieve a specific end state. Meanwhile, the Indian political aim was a delusional directive to evict the Chinese, with absolutely zero corresponding military capability or logistical planning to back it up.
It was a systematic, clinical dismantling of an unprepared opponent. The Indian Army was ordered to fight a 19th century colonial border skirmish, standing in thin lines in the river valleys. The Chinese executed a mid-20th century masterclass in combined arms, maneuver warfare, and operational art.
And that contrast is the ultimate takeaway of this deep dive. The tactical defeats at the Namkachu River, the collapse at Sela Pass, the panic in Tezpur, those were symptoms. The disease was the political arrogance, the institutional dysfunction, and the strategic blindness that sent brave men into an impossible situation.
It is a devastating chain of causality. Let's do a rapid recall for the listeners preparing for exams.
Yes, the 5-minute rapid recall. Let's hear the causal chain.
Flawed political assumptions led directly to the civil-military gap, where professional advice was ignored in favor of sycophancy. That gap led to chronic poor preparation and logistical starvation. And that lack of preparation guaranteed operational failure when faced with a vastly superior, operationally brilliant adversary, resulting in massive strategic lessons for India.
Perfect. And for those taking notes, here are your top analytical keywords to use in your answers. Forward policy, Colombo proposals, Defense Committee in the Cabinet, operational art, Fagler Ridge, line of actual control, penny packets, defense in depth, culminating point, interior lines, non-aligned movement, Sino-Soviet split, Cuban Missile Crisis timing, counterattack and self-defense, and civil-military disconnect.
Use those keywords and structure your essays around the framework of political aim leading down to operational failure.
So as we wrap up this massive exploration of the higher direction of the 1962 war, we can see how those dominoes fell to create a strategic disaster that literally rewired the geopolitics of Asia.
And while we've diagnosed the political and command failures today, we still have to look at the physical realities on the ground. How did the geography dictate the battle? Why was the Indian Air Force not used in an offensive role?
That is exactly what we will be tackling in the next part of our series. Yeah. After understanding strategic and command failures, the next module analyzes battlefield enablers, doctrine, tactics, air power, logistics, psychological warfare, and the military lessons India learned.
But before we go, I want you to consider the overarching theme of everything we discussed today. We've talked about supply lines, international treaties, nuclear threats, and the principles of operational art. But look at the core of the rot.
It was leaders.
It was leaders, both political and military, who prioritized their own pride, their pet ideological theories, and their political survival over the harsh, objective realities of the world.
They looked at a geopolitical map, saw an impending disaster, and decided to just draw a straight line over it with a marker and pretend it was fine. And they fired anyone who told them the marker didn't change the terrain.
Exactly. Which brings us to the question you have to ask about the world today. If the truest test of a nation's military security is not just the sophistication of its weapons or the bravery of its frontline soldiers, but the institutional courage of its leaders to speak uncomfortable truths to power, how well defended is any modern nation today when political convenience outshines professional reality?
A sobering thought to leave on. Keep questioning the consensus. We will see you next time for the next chapter of The Deep Dive.